The beast is down. The words hit before the replay does. The crowd is already on its feet. The clip is already everywhere. For a brief moment, reality bends not because of what happened in the cage, but because of how fast the story locks in. A single call, a single image, a single name pushed to the front of the conversation as if the conclusion has already been agreed upon. This is what fans were told would never happen. That the UFC is immune to shortcuts. That legends are earned, not declared. That no amount of noise can replace what the cage reveals over time. And yet, here we are, reacting to a moment that feels bigger than the evidence behind it. A narrative moving faster than verification. A celebration arriving before the questions even surface. With Paddy Pimblett, the discomfort doesn't come from the idea of him winning. It comes from how easily the system seems ready for it. How smoothly the storyline clicks into place. How little resistance there is to the leap from possibility to certainty. This isn't about one knockout. It's about how quickly the machine decides who the moment belongs to. And once it does, it rarely waits for permission to move on. The flaw wasn't technical. It was directional. From early on, the pattern was clear when uncertainty appeared. The response wasn't correction. It was acceleration. More pressure, more risk, more commitment to the moment instead of the position. The belief wasn't that mistakes could be fixed. It was that momentum could outrun them. That belief hardens quickly when it works. Each exchange that didn't get punished reinforced the same idea. Control is optional if the pace stays high enough. Structure becomes negotiable if the opponent hesitates. And when the outcome favors you, the method stops being questioned. This is where the flaw becomes useful. A fighter who doesn't pause doesn't recalibrate. He doesn't slow the system down. He gives it something cleaner: emotion, urgency, reaction. The system doesn't need perfection. It needs continuity. And continuity is easier to maintain when hesitation never enters the equation. The danger wasn't recklessness. It was confirmation without consequence. Moments appeared where balance shifted, where positioning opened, where a sharper response could have ended the story early, but it didn't. The exchanges resolved themselves just enough to keep the trajectory intact. No reset, no forced adjustment, just forward motion. That's the first deviation, not in performance, but in feedback. Because when warning signs don't interrupt progress, they stop being interpreted as warnings at all. They become background noise. And background noise is exactly what a system learns to ignore. Nothing breaks here. Nothing stops. But from this point on, the flaw isn't hidden anymore. It's embedded. Momentum doesn't ask for permission. It only asks to be fed. Wins stack. Reactions grow louder. The numbers look clean enough to stop the questions from forming. And with each result, the distance between performance and perception quietly widens. What began as excitement turns into expectation, not built on refinement, but on repetition. For Paddy Pimblett, the rise isn't defined by dominance. It's defined by survival with style. Moments that should slow the narrative instead fuel it. Close calls are reframed as toughness. Gaps are reframed as confidence. The lack of polish is recoded as fearlessness. The system loves this phase. Highlights circulate faster than tape study. Applause arrives faster than analysis. And every time the outcome goes his way, the same quiet question gets postponed again. Is this sustainable? The answer never has to arrive because the schedule keeps moving. Crowds chant. Cameras linger. Matchups align just well enough to maintain speed. Nothing forces a pause long enough to reassess direction. And the more the rise accelerates, the harder it becomes to justify slowing it down. Here's the trap. Success without breaks doesn't feel unstable. It feels efficient, clean, profitable. The absence of resistance is mistaken for proof that resistance isn't needed. But underneath the celebration, the same unresolved elements remain. The same openings. The same reliance on moments instead of margins. They don't disappear, they just stop being acknowledged. And when a rise never tests its limits, it doesn't reveal strength. It only reveals how much the system is willing to carry. This is where the shift becomes visible, not in the cage, but around it. The push gets smoother, the timing gets kinder. The stakes rise without forcing a recalibration. Nothing explicit is said, but everything aligns. The fighter moves forward, and the system moves with him, not because the flaws vanished, but because the momentum still produces value. Warnings exist. They always do. Analysts point to openings. Coaches mention adjustments that never fully arrive. Opponents test edges that feel closer than the results suggest. But none of it interrupts the flow, because interruption is expensive. So, the reward structure changes. Moments are amplified. Close calls are softened. Performances are framed through reaction instead of review. The narrative doesn't deny the gaps, it simply steps around them. And as long as the crowd stays engaged, the incentives remain intact. This isn't protection in the dramatic sense. It's something quieter. Matchmaking that avoids friction. Promotion that emphasizes identity over evaluation. A calendar that never leaves enough space for doubt to harden into resistance. Placed side by side, the pattern speaks for itself. Progress continues. Question stall. The machine keeps moving, and the more the system rewards continuity over correction, the harder it becomes for anyone inside it to choose friction voluntarily. Because friction doesn't sell momentum, it tests it. Nothing breaks here either. Nothing forces a stop. But from this point on, the rise is no longer organic. It's maintained. Every rise eventually meets a moment it can't outrun. It doesn't arrive as a collapse. It arrives as a test that feels ordinary on paper until it isn't. The pace stays high. The confidence stays intact. The entrances look the same. But inside the exchange, something changes. The margins tighten. The space to improvise shrinks. The moments that once resolved themselves now demand precision and don't receive it. This is the first time momentum doesn't feel like armor. It feels like weight. The event itself isn't definitive. No single sequence explains everything. In fact, the result doesn't even need to be catastrophic. What matters is the exposure, the feeling that the formula no longer controls the variables the way it used to. Reactions slow, adjustments lag. The exchanges stretch longer than expected. And for the first time, the system can't immediately smooth the edges with celebration or noise. Still, nothing is declared finished. The narrative doesn't collapse, it hesitates. From the outside, it looks manageable. From the inside, it feels different. The same approach now requires more effort. The same risks now cost more energy. The same confidence now asks for reinforcement that doesn't arrive automatically. This is the turning point, not because everything breaks, but because everything starts depending on denial. From here on, the machine has two options: force a correction or maintain the illusion that nothing has changed. And the choice it makes will define what comes next. The signs don't explode, they accumulate. Reactions arrive a fraction late. Entries take an extra step. Exchanges last longer than they should. None of it is dramatic enough to trigger alarms, but all of it is visible if you're looking for interruption. The system doesn't look for interruption, it looks for continuation. Schedules remain intact. The framing stays optimistic. The tone doesn't change. What used to be described as momentum is now described as resilience. What used to be gaps are now called adversity. Language shifts just enough to keep the direction stable. No intervention arrives. Training footage looks familiar. Walkouts feel unchanged. The surface stays calm while the effort underneath increases. Wins, when they come, cost more. Losses, when they appear, are explained away as anomalies. Nothing is allowed to settle long enough to force reassessment. This is where decline hides best. Not in collapse, but in repetition. The same approach, the same risks, the same refusal to slow down. And because the system stays silent, the feedback loop closes. Adjustments that should be mandatory become optional. Corrections that should be urgent become theoretical. The margin for error shrinks quietly, without ceremony. Crowd reactions soften. Analysis sharpens. Expectations become conditional. The distance between who the fighter is and who the story needs him to be starts to show not as a gap, but as tension. Still, everything continues. Because silence isn't absence, it's a decision. And when silence lasts long enough, decline doesn't announce itself. It simply becomes the new baseline. Collapse doesn't arrive with shock. It arrives with recognition. The results turn uneven, then predictable. What once felt explosive now feels heavy. Exchanges that used to swing momentum now expose limits. The margins that were ignored finally demand payment, and they don't accept explanations. Comparisons become unavoidable. Early performances look sharper in hindsight. Movements that once felt instinctive now look forced. The pace drops, not by choice, but by cost. Each round asks more and returns less. The system doesn't panic, it adjusts its distance. Opportunities thin. The spotlight shortens. The tone shifts from certainty to caution. Wins no longer expand the narrative. Losses don't shock anyone. They simply confirm what had been visible for a while. Treatment changes quietly. Less patience, less insulation, less urgency to protect continuity. This isn't punishment, it's reclassification. The fighter isn't framed as inevitable anymore. He's framed as situational, useful in the right context, manageable within limits. The machine doesn't turn hostile, it moves on to the next source of momentum. Nothing here feels dramatic. That's the point, because collapse, in this system, isn't a fall, it's a fade. At this point, it's tempting to reduce everything to one explanation: a fighter who didn't adapt, a style that stopped working, a rise that went too fast. But that answer is too clean, because if this were only about individual failure, the pattern wouldn't repeat. It wouldn't appear again and again, across different divisions, different personalities, different eras, all following the same arc, once momentum becomes more valuable than correction. The uncomfortable truth is simpler and harder to sit with. When a system rewards acceleration over adjustment, it doesn't just overlook flaws, it multiplies them. It turns temporary success into permanent direction. It replaces learning with continuity, and by the time reality demands a reckoning, the cost of stopping feels higher than the cost of pretending nothing changed. So the question isn't whether the fighter could have done more. The question is this: if this is just personal failure, why does it keep happening the same way, to so many people, inside the same machine? The beast is down. The line still echoes, but it lands differently now. Not as a declaration of dominance, not as a moment of arrival, but as a snapshot of how fast certainty can be manufactured. Because the image that opened this story was never about one strike, or one reaction, or one night. It was about how quickly the system decides what a moment means, and how rarely it waits to see what comes after. Nothing here was accidental. Nothing here was unique. The rise followed a familiar shape. The silence followed on schedule, and the fade arrived without resistance. He wasn't the first to be carried forward by momentum. He won't be the last to be released by it. And the system won't change, because it doesn't need to. It only needs the next moment,